Good to go. If you open up the internet, you turn on your television, read the newspaper headlines, listen to NPR or talk radio, you'll see in our country today a society that is struggling to determine what or who has ultimate authority over the life of the individual. And each individual who speaks of this, each group that speaks of this takes a different bent. Some wish to place sole authority of life specifically in the individual. Others wish to have further government restrictions or allow the government to expand its sphere of sovereignty over other sovereign nations. In other cases, people take a postmodern bent where whatever community, or we call this identity politics, defines the truth or the value is what's true for that community, and anyone who speaks against it is either an outsider or contradicting the truth of the community. And so it seems that we live in a time where individuals and groups are both looking for a proper foundation or authority upon which to live their lives and appeal to, and others also seem to be rebelling against proper authorities that God has established in His creation order, or also here in His scriptures. And yet this question, even in our seemingly so turbulent times, is not unique to today, but has rather haunted man from his creation, from the fall in the garden to the present, like a constant specter. And so today we look to 1 Kings chapter 12. If you're using a Pew Bible, you'll find that about page 293. And we will see the nation of Israel as it struggles to answer this question for itself. So if you would, please turn with me to 1 Kings 12. And in 1 Kings 12, we'll see the nation of Israel ask itself this type of question with the phrase, "What portion do we have in David?" And that is the same question I believe we ought to be asking ourselves. We'll start and we'll just walk through the passage as we go. Due to the length, I will not be covering every verse, but we will get to most of them. To begin, verses 1 through 5. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." And he said to them, "Go away for 3 days, and then come again to me." Now, if you don't know, Rehoboam is the inheritor of the throne from King Solomon, and Jeroboam was Solomon's taskmaster over the labor of temples and high places and all sorts of work that took place in Israel during his reign. And at the death of Solomon and Rehoboam coming to be recognized as king by the nation of Israel, he goes out to them. And they make of him a humble request, that you remove this heavy yoke that has been placed upon us from us. Your father put this on us. And if you're not familiar with the agricultural term yoke, it's a tool used strapped to an animal to make it a beast of burden for work in the field. And so Jeroboam and the nation of Israel is accusing Solomon of making them beasts of burden. And they're afraid, perhaps, that Rehoboam is going to do the exact same thing to him. And so they make the request, could you repent of this? And so this very action by Israel to their king is a call for him for repentance. And I say that based on Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. We're not going to turn there. But there at the end of verse 20, after God gives his word through Moses as to the duties and responsibilities of a king, he tells them to not lift your heart above that of your brother. And yet at the end of Solomon's reign, despite all of his wisdom, despite all of his virtues and how much 2 Chronicles praises him, he did turn to other gods, and he did lay a burden that was unfair upon his own brethren within his own nation. And so Rehoboam, though we will see that he is stiff-necked and hard-hearted, at least learned some wisdom from his father. That is, that when making a serious decision, go and take counsel, don't make it on your own. So he asked for 3 days, and these people who are here making the initial request look at the king's request for 3 days and say that's reasonable. They don't rebel, they don't riot, they return to their tents, and they wait for Rehoboam's answer. Going forward, Rehoboam receives wisdom from two sources, one that is wise and one that is foolish or poor counsel. The first one is the old men who served under Solomon. We see them in verses 6 and 7. And King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men, who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" And they said to him, "If you will be a servant to this people today, and serve them, and speak good words to them, when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." And the reason I call this wise counsel is the very next thing in verse 8 is Rehoboam is almost critiqued by the narrator of the passage for his decision, where he says, "But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men." Also in verse 13, it says, "And the king answered the people harshly and forsake the counsel that the old man had given him." And so, despite what their motivations might be, the text doesn't tell us. It seems to hold up the counsel of the wise men of yes, remove this burden, give your word to them, and they will serve you. You will have the kingdom, it will be yours. But instead, he takes the advice of the young men from verse 9, and he says to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father has put on us'?" And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus shall you speak to this people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us?' Thus shall you say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs, and now whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I'll discipline you with scorpions.'" It is utterly heinous that this is the advice that Rehoboam took. You see men who have been beaten down, who have served faithfully, who have not rebelled, who have not guilty of any crimes, asking for the king to simply follow the law of God as it has been given to them. And the response of his counsel is to look at the people who are suffering under the tyranny and the oppression of it and mock them. "Oh, you think it was bad before, we'll make it worse now. You think it was heavy before, we'll make you work harder. You think my whips were bad, I'm going to invent a more painful whip to hit you with so that you will bow before me." The king has no right to say these words, and yet they're the very words that when he goes to the people, they return faithfully to him despite how unfaithful he is about to be to them in 3 days, just as he has requested. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam, and the 3rd day, as the king said, "Come to me again the 3rd day." And the king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old man had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I'll discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. It was already prophesied in Solomon's time. This is why Jeroboam was off in Egypt as he is running from Solomon, because he had already been promised in 1 Kings chapter 11 that if he would obey God, that God would establish a kingdom for him. He would divide Solomon's kingdom, he would give the 10 tribes to Jeroboam, and he would make his house to last forever, just as he has for David. And so all the things that are taking place are divinely instituted. None of this is happening outside of the will of God. And yet at the same time, the focus is on the guilt of the king who by his own free choices, by his own actions, leads to the destruction of his own people. And so Israel responds, and they respond probably, at the very least in our country, how our forefathers have during the revolution, to a king they saw as tyrannical, whether right or wrong. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What portion do we have in David?" Which is our initial question. "We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your house, David." So Israel went to their tents. If you're familiar with the historical books, you'll know that in 2 Samuel chapter 20, this same proverb was said to the house of David simply because when David was finally returned to Jerusalem, that Judah took him on their own and the rest of Israel was offended by it. And yet here when they use it, more than just repeating the proverb that had already been spoken against the house of David, they add to it by telling David to look to his own house. And so the very answer to the question that they ask and raise is to say that they have nothing, no portion, to do with the house of David. In this context, for the sake of illustration, just something more contemporaneous for us. It's easy to look at the story, it's easy to read through it. There's politics, there's names, there's countries we don't understand, and maybe it's just the primitive nature of government 2,000 years ago. But just April 20th, protests started in Nicaragua, not far from here, as far as the grand scheme of the globe, where David Ortega set off an entire revolt where 40 people were killed by the police in their protest. And it was a peaceful protest at the start. And what the cause of it was simply that he decided to change the percentage of income from employers and employee that would be dedicated to their pension funds. And it set off a chain reaction. And he went through within a few days, right after the protest ends, and things are sort of settled in Managua after all the tear gas is gone, and says, I'll remove this from you. So he at least does better than Jeroboam, or Rehoboam in this case. But the history of his reign as a president for the last 11 years in Nicaragua, and back in the 70s when Nicaragua as the government it's under was being established, shows a history of continual abuses that the people just got fed up with and responded to. So it's not just that this is a historical fact recorded for us, but human nature, when oppressed by tyranny, tends to rile up and tends to respond and say, I want nothing to do with you, I want another leader. We see in verse 20 of chapter 12, and when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judea only. Same way in Nicaragua. They're calling for this man's resignation. And as soon as he walks out, they will place somebody else in his position, because nobody likes to be oppressed. And so the warning to all the kings of Israel and Judea is to not abuse your authority. And that's also the same for every other individual who's placed or given any authority, no matter how great or how small. To the pastor who will one day pastor over the flock, to the one who is a brother in treating his siblings or his parents when they age and can no longer take care of themselves as well as they once did, to be kind and gentle with them as that's handed off to you. Or also just as a father, as you raise your children, not causing them to sin simply by their resentment of you, or your treatment with gentleness towards your wife. Whatever the situation is, your authority is handed to you, and its boundaries and its duties are defined by the Word of God. And when we step out of that, either by expanding beyond them, we cause harm to those underneath us, or by being negligent in fulfilling those duties of doing the right thing and therefore doing nothing, we also cause harm to those who we are responsible for. And there's another, I've already shown you how Israel answers the question at this point in their history is to say nothing. They also bring in the character of Jeroboam. And so I wish of us to look at and see, how does Jeroboam answer the question of what portion do we have in David? Verses 25 through 27. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David, if the people will go back up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem. And then the heart of his people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they shall kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. The first thing of his response to this question is fear, despite what God has already told him. I mentioned earlier what happens in 1 Kings 11 when the prophet comes to him and he's told, hey, if you obey my laws, this kingdom is yours forever. And yet Jeroboam's first response, once he is finally made king, is to think, well, they still have to go back to the temple to offer sacrifices. So that means they're going into David's reign, and since he's the legitimate king and I'm not, forgetting that God has set him up in this way, he becomes afraid. And that fear seems to consume him, and it leads him to find some way to rid himself of that fear or of that self-prophesied end conclusion of his reign. And we see that in 27 through 30. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judea, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. Then this thing became a sin for the people and went as far as Dan to be before one. His response of fear, rather than turning to God, was to turn himself and all he was responsible towards idolatry. Instead of trusting God in his promise and in his words, he takes matters into his own hands and he runs with it towards sin. And in it, once again, just as we saw with Rehoboam, we also see Jeroboam using his authority in a negative way to bring about harm to his people. And he goes further, knowing that there is a right line that he's supposed to walk, which is probably a warning for us of walking with a veneer or walking in some form of idealized hypocrisy or with a false front, of the imitation of what was the right worship of God. Like if you notice, he puts out golden bulls. We see that, yes, in Exodus 32, but there's also the golden bulls and the ornaments and all these things that show up in the temple of God that Solomon has built. We know that there are Levite priests. Well, instead of making the Levites, he makes his own priests for his own cult. He picks the same holidays. He makes to where everything that the people would have needed to go to Jerusalem, he simply imitates it and makes some false form of it to present to the people so that he could keep their loyalty and ultimately will bring down his own destruction upon his head at a later time in the history of Israel and upon his own house. And so how does Jeroboam answer this question? Well, really everything has to do with having a portion in David's house. The only reason that he has a kingdom is because David's household was not responsible in its use of it. And he knows that God has made an eternal decree with King David's throne. And so Jeroboam's answer is to say everything and then respond to that in a way that doesn't fit what his actual answer is, by going off into idolatry and imitation and being consumed by fear rather than obedience to God. Just another example of political events and how they shape the world and how they affect it through poor leadership. The Japanese persecution of Christians, it's not something that's often spoken of because we think of Japan as this economic powerhouse with lots of technology and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which is all true. But in the 1650s, the first Christian missionaries, Catholic and Dutch Protestants, arrived largely for trading purposes to Japan and began to evangelize and set the religion. And it grew like fire because it taught something completely radically different than anything Japan had ever heard, that was ran by a caste system, was suddenly being told every person was made in the image of God. And the people loved this. They suddenly felt dignity and worth, and it wasn't that it caused them to rebel. They just realized that they were worth more than nothing, as they had been told and had been taught by being at the bottom of the caste system. Instead of recognizing the benefit of this would be to his people, Tokugawa, who was in command then, out of fear of losing everything, since people are learning that this caste system that we have is not exactly true, was to kick all the missionaries out, and next thing to crucify as many Christians as he could find, and then to make a national holiday where he would take crosses in every village and they would make them and they would throw them in the street and they would come and walk upon these crosses and stomp their heels upon them to show that they were loyal to the shogunate and not to Christianity and therefore not to the West. And the consequences of this is Japan would become known for a very long time as the hermit country, and it would also become known as completely defined by its opposition to the West, specifically because of Christianity, due to the policies that were set in place in this time. And it wouldn't be until the Black Fleet from America, with our imperialism showing up and opening Kyoto, and yet the consequence of it was Japan was 120 years now behind the rest of the world because it had cut itself off from the world. And so this fear of this Tokugawa shogunate hurt them economically, it hurt them politically, but also by chasing out the gospel, it very much hurt the souls of its people. How many people could have heard the gospel, submitted to it, instead were forced back into paganism and died in rebellion against God with never an opportunity to hear the gospel because of the fear of a king who would not allow for it to speak. And thus, our fear, when it shows up and it challenges us, will I obey God's law? Will I do the right thing? The consequences of it often aren't as small as we want them to be, and sometimes they're far greater than we ever expected them to be. And so I challenge you and I ask you to learn from the examples that are set out before us in the scriptures of those who were consumed and moved by fear to disobedience against God, to remember what he is worth, the goodness of his presence as your king, and walk in obedience rather than being overcome by fear. And yet there's still, with all this, even though we've gone through the passage, one more question to be asked. And that is, what portion do you and I have in David? It's a question the passage asked in verse 16. And so I want to point us to who is actually sitting on David's throne today. Thank God. I'd sing the doxology if I could sing and you all would actually like it. That Rehoboam or other kings who are not as worthy as the king who is currently on David's throne are no longer there. But rather Jesus Christ, who is a descendant of King David, who is the rightful heir to David's throne, sits on David's throne. We won't read it for sake of time, but if you were to go to Hebrews 1, you see a case as the author responding to his audience goes through and pulls verse after verse after verse in the Psalms that relate specifically to David as king and God's promises to him as king, and applies them directly to Jesus Christ. He goes so far as to say, "As for me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. I will hand you the iron rod, and you will break the nations. You will dash them apart like a potter's vessel," referencing Psalm 2. Christ is set up as the king who is rightfully on the throne, who can rule over all the rulers of the earth and all the kings of the earth, and he can tell them to be wise, and he can warn them of his own anger. And yet, despite his right to all these things, we see a king who is a better king than all the previous kings in the Davidic covenant. One who, though he was already enthroned in heaven, condescended to come to this earth in flesh. To come, of all things, to a time when he didn't have air conditioning or running water or even disposable diapers. And to live there, to choose it. All of this was ordered by God, by the will of himself and of his Father, working in communion. And he chose that time to go. And he becomes the perfect high priest who knows all of our wants and all of our needs, and he can empathize with us, and yet he rules justly and kindly, and therefore he is nothing like the two rulers we have seen today, one who is dominated by fear and another who is dominated by a desire to show he's bigger and badder than his daddy. This is in the case of Rehoboam. But one who genuinely remembers the commands of God, that says, "I will not lift my heart above my brothers." His commands instead tell us, "Come all ye who are weary, who are broken. My yoke is light, my burden is easy." He's the one who does not quench the candle that is about to be smothered out or break the bruised reed, but finds use and restores them. And this is the king, then, whatever your decision in regards to your portion in David, I invite you to, because the choices are either to say as Jeroboam did, everything, or to say as Israel did, nothing. And then to respond accordingly, and to wake up each day and live as if that's the case. And I would invite you to consider Jesus above all the other authorities that are here in our world that make their case, that we seek to ground ourselves upon in our need for stability and solidarity in explaining our life. Because we have seen sinners set up sinners as authorities and then watch them sin and been surprised when those are the results. And yet here we have a good and gracious king who is without sin, who has died for us, who has been resurrected for us, who has bared the full wrath of his Father's wrath on our behalf, and is willing to setting us free. I mean, if he was a president, he would be the president with the most open-ended border policy we have ever heard. He wants every people from every tribe and nation and tongue to come to him. There isn't the discrimination, there isn't the lording over, but rather him ruling wisely and for the benefit of those who are under him. He is the perfect example of authority used rightly. And yet, as we think through and ponder from side to side of what we should do, there's the cry of the human heart wondering, is this too good to be true? Is there one who's actually capable of leading us in the right direction? And there's a band that really writes a song that covers it quite well. You might remember them from middle school. The Flowbots did I Ride My Bike with No Handlebars? Not the song we're using, but same band. They also wrote one called Stand Up. And it goes like this: "We shall not be moved except by a child with no socks and shoes. And if you got more to give, then you've got more to prove. Put your hands up and I'll copy you. Stand up, we shall not be moved. except by a woman dying from a loss of food. And if you've got more to give, then you've got more to prove. Put your hands up and I'll copy you. We still don't understand thunder and lightning, flashbacks to when we didn't fund the dam. Didn't fund the dam levee, no wonder, man. Now our whole damn city's torn us under, man. Underwater, but we still don't understand. We see hurricane spills overrun the land through gaps you couldn't fill with 100 tons of sand. No, we still don't understand. We've seen planes in the windows of buildings crumble in. We've seen flames sending chills through London. We've sent planes to kill them, and some of them are children. But still, we crumble under building, underfunded, but we still don't understand, under God, but we kill the Son of Sam. But if you feel like I feel about the Son of Man, we will overcome. There's a band that wrote the song, between 2000 and 2010, and basically chronicles every major catastrophe that we saw flashed across Fox News and CNN and the local TV channel. And the only answer they seem to be able to find, which is the same answer the scriptures point us to, is that we need someone who is good enough, but also powerful enough, who has the authority and will not abuse it, to answer the problems of our day. Specifically in our lives and also in the greater problems of society as we seek to see it transformed by watching the gospel go out or imposing good values and hoping people come to love each other. It is Christ who changes us. And it is Christ who's expanding his kingdom for the goodness of all the peoples of the earth. And so I invite you to decide, what portion do you have in David? I pray, I hope, I beg for you that your answer is everything. Thank you.